Netanyahu is doing what he can to stay in power. And that's why we don't see a hostage deal that would get some of these folks back home. We saw him speak last night. He gave a press conference in English, which was quite remarkable. He brings out a long pointer pen and a map and starts giving what looks like a lecture to the journalists in the room about the Middle East, about how small Gaza is in comparison to the threats that Israel faces on all fronts. That sort of argument we've heard him make before. This coming down to, and the international pressure that's added by an arms embargo like this, which Israel has been calling sanctions, is that the long-term effect of what does this have if Western allies, Western partners start to become uh, choosy about how they support Israel in any war effort.
A piece today in the digital edition of The Times by George Grills and our defence editor Larissa Brown about how a UK arms embargo to Israel could be widened over further humanitarian breaches. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, suspended 30 export licences to Israel out of a total of about 350 because of a clear risk the weapons could be used to commit serious violations of international law. Those are his words. It's been reported in the last 24 hours, a Western official who's been defending the UK's arms restrictions says the way Israel's waging its war in the territory has forced Western democracies to walk a difficult tightrope with Israel, and they warned it could make the country less safe in the long run. Let's get you some context and head to Israel, speak to freelance journalist Zach Anders, who's in Tel Aviv. Now, we've seen all these protests, haven't we, Zach, against Benjamin Netanyahu's failure to do a hostage deal. Now the UK's saying it's going to restrict certain arms, and that could go further. Benjamin Netanyahu, is he kind of losing his grip now on this situation? Is it spiraling beyond his control?
Yeah, tough question. Good morning. Good to be with you, by the way. It's in a situation for the prime minister. I mean, since this war began, it's been pretty critical. Is this spiraling? Well, the situation on the ground in Tel Aviv with these protests has certainly picked up a notch, but you got to remember that these protests have the hostage deal now calls have been existent since this war began, 11 months now. And they've been doing the same sort of tactics that we saw make the international headlines and the television all across the world the other night when they're blocking the prime minister's residence and tearing down some of the temporary gates around the streets nearby. And those seem like pretty severe scenes. But again, I just need to reiterate that we've been seeing that around his residence in Jerusalem and on the streets of Tel Aviv for months. This has been a very unstable situation. So perhaps it's more remarkable on the prime minister's part that through all of this, he's been able to hold together his coalition, stay in power, and continue to lead despite being in very difficult situations from all sides. I think the most important thing here is that when you look at some of the polling data that's done by institutes here in Israel, is that he would still hang on or be very close in an election if it were held today. That there hasn't been a clear opposition leader who has come through this fight and symbolized somebody that could replace this wartime effort under Netanyahu's administration.
A lot of the protests, from my understanding of the situation anyway, do seem to be revolving around, the failure to do a hostage deal, and the hostages, as opposed to, the way the war is being waged. And I just wonder, you're in Tel Aviv, you're speaking to Israelis all the time. What's the mood there about the actual sort of the conduct of the way the war is being waged? Because that seems to be the basis for why the UK is saying we need to be restricting certain arms to Israel now.
Well, I'll say on the outset, when you talk to people here in Israel, the scoff that you get from most people in the coffee shops on the street is that Netanyahu is doing what he can to stay in power. And that's why we don't see a hostage deal that would get some of these folks back home. We saw him speak last night. He gave a press conference in English, which was quite remarkable. He brings out a long pointer pen and a map and starts giving what looks like a lecture to the journalists in the room about the Middle East, about how small Gaza is in comparison to the threats that Israel faces on all fronts. That sort of argument we've heard him make before. This coming down to, and the international pressure that's added by an arms embargo like this, which Israel has been calling sanctions, is that the long-term effect of what does this have if Western allies, Western partners start to become uh, choosy about how they support Israel in any war effort, because this isn't going to immediately, these 30 arms licenses, it's not like this was, the UK themselves stopping a shipment that was, about to head to Israel. This is restricting future sales of private companies, defense contractors being able to sell some of these components to Israel. I should say it's also not entirely clear what these components are. It's imagined that this is similar to what we saw the U.S. do a few months ago when they restricted the provision of these 2,000-pound bombs. That potentially this is components for some of the weapons that could be used, again, as David Lammy is saying, could be used to commit human rights violations. It was very clear that he said that they don't have evidence that has been used for human rights violations, but again, could be used. Is this going to affect the situation on the ground in the immediate term? No, this is going to affect a long-term relationship, long-term standing with Israel going forward. It's a really interesting element here too, because without knowing what specifically these components are, we can't say how this will impact Israel. But at the same time, David Lammy saying it's not going to affect components that are used for the F-35 program. Well, if you are really concerned that there are human rights violations taking place, and you've made a argument in prior interviews about what those human rights violations look like, well, it 100% comes from the airplanes that are dropping the bombs and the
Yeah.
precision and the dumb bombs.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it sort of raises even more questions, doesn't it? Zach, thank you so much. Zach Anders in Tel Aviv, talking about the latest on Israel. You can read more about that in the Times.